Andre, pilot this ship, and I'll reveal the truth about Jesus," the alien mocked, and froze when I flew it. I never expected my last flight would be one I wasn't trained for, in a craft that shouldn't exist, guided by something inside me I didn't know was there. The desert has a way of stripping you down to what's essential. No distractions, no noise, just you and the vast silence that makes you confront who you really are. After 20 years in the Air Force, after missions I can't talk about and skies I've claimed as my own, I thought I'd seen everything the heavens had to offer. I retired to this isolated stretch of Arizona wilderness not to escape, but to find peace in the emptiness, to let the wind and sand smooth over the rough edges of a life spent in service. My trailer sits alone beneath a canopy of stars so thick they look like spilled diamonds. And most nights I'd sit outside with my coffee, feeling small but somehow connected to something greater. I'd pray sometimes, quietly, asking God what it all meant. The wars, the loss, the purpose of pushing metal through clouds while men below fought and bled. The desert never answered, but it listened, and that was enough. Until the night the sky cracked open with light so brilliant it turned midnight into noon, and I knew with absolute certainty that my real mission was only just beginning. The sound came after, a roar that shook the earth beneath my boots and sent my coffee mug tumbling into the dust. Something had fallen from the heavens, something burning and impossible, and it had landed less than a mile from my door. Against every rational thought screaming in my head, to call someone, to wait, to hide, I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the glow, rising over the ridge, my heart hammered with a mixture of fear and something else, something that felt like recognition, like I'd been waiting my whole life for this moment without knowing it. The crash site was a wound in the desert, a crater still smoking with heat that made the air shimmer and dance like water. The craft itself defied description, smooth and geometric yet organic, as if it had been grown rather than built, its surface reflecting starlight in colors I'd never seen before. I stood at the edge of that crater, my breath caught in my throat, feeling the presence of something profound and terrifying radiating from within that impossible machine. The rational part of my mind catalogued escape routes, assessed threats, calculated odds. The training never leaves you, but something deeper, something primal and spiritual, rooted me to that spot and whispered that I was meant to be here, that this was divine appointment disguised as cosmic accident. The hatch opened without sound, unfolding like a metal flower, and steam or smoke poured out in ghostly ribbons that caught the moonlight. I raised my flashlight with a trembling hand, the beam cutting through the haze, and then I saw it, the figure emerging from within, tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long and joints that bent in ways that made my eyes hurt to follow. Its skin was like polished obsidian, reflecting my light back at me in fractured patterns, but it was the eyes that stopped my heart. Liquid silver, swirling like mercury, ancient and cold, and filled with an intelligence so vast it made me feel like an insect under observation. I wanted to run, every instinct screamed at me to flee, but my legs wouldn't move, and then I heard it. Not with my ears, but inside my skull, a voice that resonated in the hollow spaces of my mind. The words came like cold water poured directly into my thoughts, bypassing language, bypassing sound, arriving fully formed with meanings deeper than any spoken phrase could carry. Primitive, it said, and I felt the contempt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Limited, bound to flesh and gravity, dreaming of heavens you'll never reach. I staggered back, hands pressed to my temples, trying to block out the intrusion, but there was no defense against something speaking from inside your own consciousness. The alien descended from its craft with movements that seemed to ignore the laws of physics, floating more than walking, and I could feel its amusement radiating like heat from its impossible form. It circled me slowly, and I felt exposed in a way I'd never experienced, not just physically naked, but spiritually stripped. as if every secret, every sin, every doubt and fear was visible to those mercury eyes. Your species amuses. Us? The voice continued, dripping with mockery. Building towers to touch clouds, calling it progress, praying to gods you invented to comfort yourselves in the darkness. My jaw clenched, anger cutting through the fear, the part of me that had faced enemy fire and survived finding its voice. And what are you? I managed to speak aloud, my voice rough and small against the desert silence. What gives you the right to judge us? The alien's head tilted in a gesture that might have been laughter, and the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. It raised one elongated limb toward its ship, and the hatch responded, opening wider to reveal an interior that glowed with soft, pulsing light that seemed alive and aware. I offer you a test, fragile creature. The voice in my mind took on an edge of cruel entertainment, a demonstration of the gulf between your kind and true intelligence. Inside the craft, suspended in the center of that impossible space, was a sphere of pure luminescence, rotating slowly, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Pilot this vessel with your mind alone. The alien's mockery intensified. Move it even 1 inch, using only your consciousness, and I will reveal to you a truth about your Jesus, the one you pray to in your ignorance, that will shatter every foundation your faith rests upon. The challenge hung in the air like a dare from the universe itself, and I felt something stir deep in my chest, something that had been sleeping my entire life, suddenly opening one ancient eye. Without fully understanding why, without weighing the consequences or calculating the odds, I stepped forward into that alien light, my boots crossing the threshold between the world I knew and mysteries I was never supposed to touch. The moment my hands made contact with that luminous sphere, everything changed, not just in the ship, but in me, in the fabric of reality itself, and the alien's mockery died in an instant, replaced by something I never expected to see in those silver eyes, absolute, terrified shock. The sphere wasn't just responding to my touch, it was singing to it, humming with a frequency that resonated in my bones, in my blood, in the deepest chambers of my heart, where I'd always kept my prayers hidden away. The ship trembled, then lifted, smooth as a breath, as if gravity itself had forgotten we existed, and I wasn't controlling it so much as communing with it, thinking directions that became reality before the thought fully formed. Through the transparent sections of the hull that suddenly appeared around us, I watched the desert floor drop away, my trailer becoming a speck of silver in an ocean of sand, and I felt the alien's presence beside me shift from superiority to something raw and unguarded. Those liquid silver eyes were locked on me now, not with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen, but with the intensity of someone witnessing an impossibility, a violation of everything they understood about the universe. I could feel its mind probing mine, no longer mocking but desperate, searching for an explanation that refused to materialize. The voice in my head came again, but this time stripped of arrogance, trembling with confusion that bordered on fear. What are you? This cannot be. Your species, you were mapped, catalogued, limited by design. I turned to face the being fully, still connected to the sphere, still holding us suspended between earth and stars, and found my own voice steady, despite the impossibility of everything happening. I'm just a man, I said quietly, a pilot who learned to trust something beyond instruments and training. The alien moved backward, its elongated form seeming to contract, to make itself smaller, in a gesture I recognized from 1,000 different cultures and species separated by biology, but united in one universal language. The posture of encountering something sacred that shouldn't exist in your carefully ordered worldview. It produced devices from somewhere within its form, sleek instruments that glowed with purpose, and began passing them around my body in scanning motions that left trails of light in the air, But the instruments flickered, sparked, died in sequence, each one failing as if my mere presence was incompatible with their function, as if I was wrapped in something their technology couldn't penetrate or measure. The frustration radiating from the alien was palpable, mixing with growing alarm that I could taste like copper on my tongue. The readings, they make no sense. The voice in my mind was almost pleading now, desperate for understanding. You should be standard biological matter, carbon-based, limited, incapable of interfacing with technology designed for consciousness 3 evolutionary stages beyond yours. I felt the ship responding to my slightest thought, banking gently as I wondered what the Earth looked like from higher up, and we rose further, the curvature of the planet beginning to show itself in breathtaking beauty. Maybe your measurements are incomplete, I offered, not with arrogance, but with genuine wonder. Maybe there's something in us you didn't account for because you were looking with the wrong instruments. The alien was silent for a long moment, those silver eyes studying me with an intensity that felt like it could peel back layers of reality itself. And then something shifted in its demeanor. The fear remained, but now mixed with what I could only describe as reluctant awe. There is a frequency. It began slowly, each word chosen with careful precision, a pattern woven into the fundamental fabric of existence that we call the signature, the fingerprint of the architect, the first consciousness that dreamed reality into being. My hands remained on the sphere, but my full attention was on the alien now, my heart beating faster because something ancient in my spirit recognized that we were approaching the edge of revelation. Only beings touched by this signature can interface with technology built on its principles, the alien continued, and I heard something in that mental voice that might have been reverence. We engineered our ships to respond only to this frequency because it is incorruptible, pure, beyond deception or theft. It is the language of creation itself. The implication hung in the air between us, unspoken but thunderous, and I felt tears sting my eyes without fully understanding why. "And you're saying I have this signature?" I whispered aloud, my voice breaking on the words. The alien's form seemed to shimmer, and when it spoke again, there was no mockery left, only a kind of terrified wonder. "You shouldn't. Your species was marked as void of it, empty of the divine frequency, but you burn with it like a star, like you were written in the same hand that wrote the first word of existence." The ship descended gently back toward the desert floor, at my unspoken request, my mind reeling with implications I couldn't yet process, and I watched the alien carefully as we settled once more near the crash site. It moved to a panel that materialized from the smooth interior wall, and with gestures that seemed almost ritualistic, activated a display that filled the air with light and moving images that bypassed my eyes entirely and wrote themselves directly into my understanding. "If you truly carry the signature," the alien said, and its voice in my mind was quieter now, almost humble, "then you must see what we have hidden, what my kind has kept secret across 1,000 worlds and 10,000 generations." The display shifted and focused, and suddenly I was seeing not images, but experiencing memories, visions from perspectives that weren't human, from eyes that had witnessed things in corners of the galaxy where human telescopes had never pointed their gaze. And there, walking among alien skies with suns of different colors painting his face in unfamiliar light, was a figure I recognized instantly despite the impossible context. Recognized because I'd carried his image in my heart since childhood, had called on his name in cockpits at 40,000 feet when missiles locked on and death whispered close. Jesus, my Jesus, moving among the stars, with the same signature blazing from him, like the light that had guided wise men across ancient deserts. And I understood with sudden, overwhelming clarity that the story was so much bigger, so much more beautiful than I'd ever imagined, and my faith didn't shatter. It exploded outward into infinite space, finally large enough to hold the truth of a God whose love encompassed not just one world, but all of creation singing in harmony with his eternal name. The visions continued to unfold before me like pages of a cosmic gospel, and I watched Jesus move through alien cities built of crystal and light, his hands touching beings whose forms defied earthly biology, but whose eyes reflected the same hunger for meaning that I'd seen in every human face I'd ever known. He spoke to them, and though the languages were incomprehensible, the message resonated in my chest with perfect clarity. Love as the foundation of existence, sacrifice as the bridge between the mortal and eternal, grace as the force that held atoms together and caused stars to burn with purpose rather than random fusion. I saw him, teaching councils of beings whose civilizations had mastered technologies that would look like magic to human eyes, yet they sat at his feet like children, their advanced minds humbled before truths that transcended their equations and formulae. The alien beside me remained silent, letting the vision speak, but I felt its presence trembling with something that might have been shame or might have been grief for time wasted in concealment. I watched Jesus raise his hands toward alien skies, and the signature blazed from him like music made visible, and I understood that this frequency, this divine fingerprint, wasn't just a marker of authentication, but the very substance of his being, the creative word made manifest, the love of God translated into a language that every dimension could comprehend. The vision shifted, and I witnessed the crucifixion from perspectives that staggered my mind. Not just the hill outside Jerusalem, where Roman soldiers cast lots for garments and darkness covered the afternoon sky, but the simultaneous echo of that moment rippling across the cosmos, like a stone dropped into an infinite ocean. I saw alien worlds pause in their rotations, saw beings light years away stop in their daily routines, as something fundamental in the fabric of reality tore and then rewove itself stronger, saw the signature pulse through galaxies like a heartbeat returning to a body that had been clinically dead. The resurrection wasn't just a man walking out of a tomb in ancient Palestine. It was a declaration written into the quantum foundation of existence itself, a promise that death had been defeated not just for one species on one small planet, but for all consciousness everywhere that chose to align itself with love rather than entropy, with grace rather than chaos. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot against my skin in the cool interior of the ship, because I understood that every prayer I'd ever whispered, every moment I'd felt Christ's presence in the cockpit or the desert or the quiet hours before dawn, had been part of this larger story, this cosmic drama of redemption that made humanity not insignificant but central, not abandoned, but chosen as witnesses to the most important truth in creation. The alien finally spoke, and the voice in my mind was stripped of every pretense, naked with confession that carried the weight of millennia. "We have hidden this knowledge," it said, and I heard shame in those words that resonated across species barriers. My kind and others like us, civilizations that deemed themselves advanced, wise, worthy of controlling the narrative of existence. We saw what happened when the architect sent his emissary to Earth, saw how your species received the signature through his teaching, through his sacrifice, through his victory over death that echoed in frequencies we could measure but not replicate. The being moved closer, and I saw something like tears forming in those liquid silver eyes, though whether they were made of water or light or regret made tangible I couldn't say. "We were afraid," the confession continued, "afraid that if humanity understood the full scope of what you carry, the divine imprint written into your very DNA by virtue of Christ's connection to your species, you would rise beyond our ability to observe, to study, to contain, that you would become what you were always meant to be, bridges between heaven and earth, ambassadors of the signature to races that had forgotten or never known the architect's love." I felt anger flash through me, hot and righteous, at the thought of truth deliberately concealed, of humanity kept small by the fear of beings who claimed superiority. But beneath the anger was something deeper, gratitude that despite the concealment, despite the conspiracy of silence across the stars, the message had survived, had been carried in human hearts through 2,000 years of doubt and persecution and martyrdom. The ship began its descent without my conscious direction, responding to some unspoken agreement between us that this encounter was reaching its completion, and through the transparent sections of hull I watched my patch of Arizona desert rushing up to meet us with its ancient stones and patient silence. The alien moved to what I recognized as a position of profound respect, lowering itself in a gesture that its physiology clearly wasn't designed for but managed anyway, and spoke final words that I knew I would carry for whatever remained of my life. Tell them. The voice in my mind was a whisper now, intimate and urgent. Tell your species that they are not cosmic accidents, not random arrangements of carbon and water that learned to think and then invented God out of loneliness. Tell them that the signature blazes in them, that Jesus walked among the stars before and after his earthly ministry, that his message of love was meant to unite not just tribes or nations, but galaxies, dimensions, all of creation groaning for redemption. The ship touched down with a gentleness that belied its otherworldly origin, and as the opening appeared in the hull, letting in the clean desert air and the first light of approaching dawn, the alien remained, kneeling, those silver eyes meeting mine with something that transcended species, transcended the gulf between human and whatever this being was, a recognition of shared creation, shared purpose, shared awe before the infinite love of God who had written his name into the foundations of reality and called it very good. The control sphere pulsed beneath my palms with a rhythm that felt disturbingly organic, warm and almost breathing, its surface rippling with colors that had no names in any human language I knew. I hadn't expected it to feel alive, hadn't anticipated that the moment my skin made contact with this alien technology, something would shift, not just in the ship, but within the deepest chambers of my own consciousness, as though a door I'd never known existed had suddenly opened in a room I'd inhabited my entire life. The alien stood behind me, its presence radiating that mocking superiority, waiting for my inevitable failure, for the confirmation of humanity's limitations that would validate its cosmic arrogance. But instead of rejection, instead of the cold indifference of machinery that recognized me as foreign, the sphere responded with what I can only describe as recognition, a welcoming that bypassed all logic and spoke directly to something ancient coiled in my DNA. The ship lifted smoothly, impossibly, with none of the mechanical resistance I'd experienced in every aircraft I'd ever flown, rising as if gravity itself had simply agreed to release us out of courtesy rather than force. Through my peripheral vision, I saw the alien's posture change, saw the liquid silver of its eyes widen with an emotion that might have been shock or might have been the first crack in a certainty that had stood unchallenged for millennia. My breath caught in my throat as the desert floor fell away beneath us, and I realized I wasn't piloting this craft so much as participating in a conversation with it. My intentions translated instantly into motion through channels I couldn't name but could somehow feel. The alien's voice crashed into my mind with none of its earlier amusement, sharp now with something that sounded dangerously close to fear, demanding with an urgency that vibrated through my skull. "What are you?" The question repeated, layered with harmonics that suggested it was scanning me with instruments I couldn't see, technologies that should have penetrated every secret written in my cells and neurons. Yet I felt those invisible probes glancing off something, failing to find purchase, flickering like faulty lights around my body. I wanted to answer, but had no words that made sense. wanted to say I was just a man, just a retired pilot who'd seen too much combat and sought peace in empty places. But even as those thoughts formed, I knew they were incomplete, knew that something else resided in me that I'd carried without understanding, written in a script older than my conscious memory. The ship banked smoothly through my intention alone, and I felt the alien's confusion mounting, felt its certainty crumbling like a foundation discovering it had been built on sand rather than stone all along. "This is impossible," the voice insisted, though whether it spoke to me or to itself I couldn't determine. "Your species was catalogued, analyzed, your genetic structure mapped and understood. You should not carry the signature. You should not be able to interface with technology keyed to the architect's frequency." The words tumbled through my awareness faster now, desperate, and I understood I was witnessing something profound. A being whose entire worldview had just encountered evidence that contradicted millennia of assumptions. My hands remained steady on the sphere, feeling the ship's systems opening to me like flowers to sunlight, and somewhere in the chaos of my thoughts, a prayer rose unbidden. Not words exactly, but a reaching toward God that felt suddenly more real than the craft surrounding us. The alien moved into my line of sight, and for the first time since emerging from its vessel, it seemed diminished, uncertain, its towering form no longer radiating superiority, but something closer to the vulnerability I'd felt in my own darkest hours when the universe seemed too vast and my place in it too small. "We believed we understood creation," it spoke quietly now, the mental voice stripped of pretense. "Believed we had mapped the architect's design, categorized which species carried the divine imprint and which were merely biological. Accidents achieving temporary sentience before returning to cosmic dust. I felt the ship responding to my unspoken desire to hover, to pause this impossible flight, while something more important than navigation unfolded between us, and we hung suspended above the desert like a prayer, waiting for answer. The being's silver eyes met mine, and I saw my own reflection there, saw myself not as I'd always perceived, worn, ordinary, carrying failures like scars across my soul, but as something else, something that blazed with a light I'd never noticed because I'd been looking with the wrong kind of vision. "The signature," the alien continued, and reverence had crept into its tone, replacing mockery with something that might have been the first honest worship it had offered in ages. "We thought it was reserved for beings who had evolved beyond mortality, beyond the needs of flesh, beyond the limitations of faith that required belief without evidence. But here I was, human and flawed and carried by grace rather than achievement, interfacing with technology that responded to the frequency of divine love as surely as a tuning fork resonates with its matching pitch." The alien reached toward me with a gesture that might have been supplication, and I understood that this moment was changing both of us, rewriting assumptions on both sides of an encounter that neither of us had anticipated when that blinding light first tore across my desert sky. In the silence that followed, suspended between earth and stars, I felt the presence of Jesus as surely as I'd felt it in every genuine prayer I'd ever offered. That quiet certainty that I was known completely and loved anyway, that presence that had carried me through combat, missions and loss, and the long recovery of faith after doubt, had nearly destroyed it. The ship thrummed around us with what felt like approval, its systems singing in harmonics that my ears couldn't hear, but my spirit recognized as worship, as technology acknowledging its creator through the medium of a frequency that transcended circuitry and intention. The alien watched me with those impossible eyes, and I knew it was beginning to understand what I was only now grasping myself, that the signature wasn't about superiority or evolution or achieving some cosmic threshold of worthiness, but about grace, about God choosing to write his love into the foundations of those who would receive it, about Jesus carrying that divine frequency to earth and leaving it blazing in everyone who accepted the impossible truth that we were loved beyond measure or merit. My hands lifted from the sphere, and the ship continued to hover, stable and waiting, as though it had no need of my continued contact now that it had verified what I carried, now that it had tasted the signature and found it authentic. The alien's voice came one more time, soft and wondering. "Tell me about him, about the one who walked your world and left you burning with the architect's own frequency." And as the first edge of sun broke over the eastern mountains, painting the desert in gold and shadow, I began to speak. About Jesus, about love that conquered death and grace that rewrote the rules of existence, and the alien listened like a child hearing truth for the first time. The alien's confusion manifested physically in ways I hadn't anticipated, its form seeming to flicker at the edges like a hologram losing coherence, and I watched as it stepped back from me with movements that had lost all their earlier grace and confidence. Its hands, or what served as hands in its physiology, trembled as they manipulated devices that materialized from nowhere, instruments that glowed with symbols I couldn't read, but whose purpose became clear as beams of light played across my body, scanning with an intensity that should have felt invasive, but instead felt merely desperate. I stood still and let it work, feeling the probes wash over me like water seeking a way through stone, sensing their confusion when they encountered something they couldn't categorize or contain, some quality in my being that refused to resolve into data their systems could process. The alien's silver eyes flickered rapidly, and I understood I was watching the equivalent of panic in a species that had probably forgotten what genuine surprise felt like after millennia of believing they had decoded the universe's essential mysteries. "This cannot be," it whispered into my mind, the words fractured and repeating like a damaged recording. "The genetic markers do not align with the signature bearers we have documented. Your species was measured and found ordinary, yet the frequency emanates from you as clearly as light from a star." I wanted to tell it that God's grace had never operated according to formulas that could be captured in databases, that love by its very nature exceeded every attempt to reduce it to predictable patterns, but I held my peace and waited for understanding to dawn in a consciousness so different from my own. The devices continued their failing examination, cycling through spectrums of light that painted the interior of the ship in cascading colors, each scan producing results that seemed to deepen rather than resolve the alien's confusion. I felt one probe penetrate deeper, reaching not just into my flesh, but towards something more fundamental, touching the places where memory and identity blur into the mystery of consciousness itself. And for a moment, I saw myself as the technology saw me, a pattern of light and intention, wrapped around a core that blazed with a frequency the instruments recognized but couldn't explain. The alien made a sound that didn't translate into language, but conveyed pure bewilderment, and its hands moved faster now, adjusting settings with what looked like increasing desperation, as though by recalibrating its instruments it might force reality to conform to its expectations rather than the other way around. "You should not exist as you are," it insisted, and I heard beneath the words a kind of existential distress, the vertigo of a mind encountering evidence that its foundational understanding of creation was incomplete. I thought of all the times I'd felt that same vertigo in reverse, moments when my faith wavered and I demanded that God prove himself according to my limited criteria, justify his ways using logic I could grasp with my finite reasoning. The parallel struck me with force. Here was a being technologically superior to humanity, yet just as prone to the error of believing that intelligence alone could comprehend divine mystery, that scanning tools and genetic databases could capture the fullness of what God chose to write into those who accepted his love. The alien finally ceased its scanning, and the instruments vanished as mysteriously as they'd appeared, leaving us in the soft glow of the ship's ambient light, while something like resignation settled over the being's features. It sank down, not quite kneeling but lowering itself in a posture that suggested a hierarchy had reversed, that I now occupied a position above it in some cosmic order it was only beginning to perceive. "We have traveled between stars for longer than your civilization has existed." It spoke slowly, each word, weighted with the cost of admission. "We have encountered thousands of species, catalogued the rise and fall of empires that spanned entire galaxies, and in all that time, we believed we understood the architect's design, believed we knew which beings carried the divine imprint and why." Its eyes met mine with an openness that felt like vulnerability, like a mask dropping away to reveal the genuine seeking beneath. "But you, your species, you were not supposed to be among the chosen, not according to our measurements, our understanding of how the signature manifests and why." I felt compassion rise in me for this ancient being confronting the limits of its knowledge, recognizing in its struggle my own journey from certainty through doubt toward a faith that could hold mystery without demanding all answers immediately. The ship hummed around us like a congregation awaiting the sermon, and I understood that what happened next mattered not just for us, but for truths that needed speaking across the vast distances between worlds. In the settling silence, I felt the presence of the Holy Spirit as tangibly as I'd felt it in any church or prayer. That gentle conviction that guides the alien's voice entered my mind with a different quality now, stripped of its earlier arrogance and carrying instead the weight of confession, of secrets held too long in darkness, finally brought toward light. "The signature," it began, and I felt the concept unfold in my consciousness, not as mere words, but as layered understanding, images and meanings compressed into a transmission that bypassed language entirely, "is not a metaphor or primitive superstition dressed in scientific terms. It is a literal frequency, a harmonic embedded in the deepest structure of DNA, written there by the one you call God, but whom we have known across 1,000 names as the architect of all worlds." I watched as the air between us shimmered and resolved into floating strands of what looked like genetic code, spiraling helixes that glowed with inner light, and within their twisted ladder structure I saw pulses of luminescence moving in patterns that reminded me of music, of rhythm and intention flowing through biological form. "We discovered this frequency millennia before your species developed written language," the alien continued, its silver eyes fixed on the genetic display with something approaching reverence. "And we learned that only those beings who carry this specific harmonic can interface with technologies built upon the architect's fundamental designs, ships like this one, devices that respond not to mechanical input, but to consciousness itself, to intention shaped by the presence of the divine blueprint." The implications cascaded through my understanding like dominoes, falling in elaborate patterns, and I realized I was being shown the mechanics of grace, the scientific face of what faith had always known, that God marks those he chooses in ways that transcend the merely symbolic. The genetic strands multiplied around us until we stood within a constellation of DNA, each helix representing a different species, from worlds I'd never imagined, and I watched as the alien gestured toward them with movements that had become almost liturgical in their careful precision. "See here," it indicated a cluster of helixes that pulsed with steady golden light. "These are the species we identified as signature bearers, beings whose genetic structure carries the architect's frequency clearly, unmistakably, their presence in the universe, a testament to divine selection across creation." The lights were beautiful, each one a declaration that God's attention had touched beings beyond human understanding, that his love extended farther than our earthbound theology had dared to imagine, and I felt my heart expand with a joy that bordered on pain, the pleasure of discovering that heaven's scope exceeded every limitation I'd unconsciously placed upon it. These species built civilizations in conscious partnership with the sacred, the alien explained, and I heard in its mental voice both admiration and something darker, an emotion I couldn't quite name. They moved through the cosmos, knowing themselves beloved, carrying that knowledge in their very cells, and the universe opened before them like a garden prepared for expected guests. Then its gesture shifted, indicating the vast darkness beyond that illuminated cluster, and my breath caught as I understood what I was seeing. Thousands upon thousands of dim helixes, species measured and found wanting, catalogued as ordinary, as cosmically insignificant in the grand design that these beings believed they'd decoded. Your species resided here. The alien's thought touched a helix at the very edge of the dim constellation, a genetic strand so faint I could barely distinguish it from the surrounding darkness, and the sorrow I felt threatened to overwhelm me. When we first surveyed Earth, we found no trace of the signature in human DNA, it continued, and now I recognized the emotion I'd heard earlier. It was shame, the admission of catastrophic error by those who'd positioned themselves as judges of cosmic worth. We classified you as peripheral to the architect's plan, a young species that might develop interesting philosophies but would never touch the fundamental truths that required the divine frequency to perceive, and we moved on to catalogue other worlds, other civilizations, believing we understood the criteria by which God distributed his intimate attention. Wanted to rage at the arrogance, the presumption that any created being could measure divine love's reach with instruments and databases. But the alien was already moving our perspective, zooming toward Earth's dim helix with velocity that suggested urgency, and I watched as the faint genetic strand suddenly blazed with light so brilliant I had to look away. Something changed, the alien whispered, and I heard awe fracture its telepathic voice into harmonics that rang like cathedral bells. At a specific point in your history, the signature appeared in human DNA, not as a gradual evolution, but as an instantaneous transformation, a frequency insertion that our models said was impossible, because it suggested the architect had directly intervened, had reached into the genetic structure of an entire species and rewritten them at the most fundamental level. The blazing helix rotated before us, and I saw the transformation point marked like a seam in history, a before and after that divided humanity into what we had been and what we'd become through divine intervention. We trace the change back to a single event, a moment when the frequency first manifested in your world through one individual whose genetic signature burned brighter than any we'd ever documented, so bright that it rippled outward like light through water, touching every human consciousness in ways we still don't fully comprehend. The alien's hands moved through the holographic display, isolating that original signature bearer, and I knew before it showed me, knew in my bones and blood what I was about to see, tears already forming as the image resolved into a man walking dusty roads under Middle Eastern sun, his presence radiating waves of golden light that the alien technology represented as pure frequency, as the universe's fundamental harmonic made flesh. The one you call Jesus. The alien spoke his name with a reverence that transcended species boundaries, carried the signature in fullness, was the signature incarnate, and his presence on your world rewrote humanity's genetics, destiny, in ways that make you not peripheral but central to a cosmic story we are only beginning to understand. I fell to my knees then, overwhelmed by the convergence of faith and evidence, by seeing through alien eyes what my heart had always known, that Christ's coming had changed not just spiritual reality, but physical creation itself, that grace operated on every level of existence, from the cellular to the celestial, and that God's love could be measured in frequencies that made starships respond to human touch. The holographic vision expanded around me until the desert floor vanished beneath constellations that wheeled with purpose, galaxies rotating in patterns that suggested not chaos but choreography, And at the center of this cosmic display walked the figure of Jesus, his form both human and more than human, radiating that golden frequency the alien had named the signature, but which I recognized now as the visible manifestation of perfect love. I watched him move between worlds I couldn't name, stepping across light years as easily as crossing a room. And everywhere his presence touched, the universe responded, planets blooming with new life, dying stars rekindling with borrowed fire, and beings of 1,000 different forms gathering to hear him speak truths that transcended the limitations of their varied languages. The alien's voice whispered through my overwhelmed consciousness with something approaching worship. We found records of his journeys in civilizations so ancient their suns have long since collapsed into darkness, testimonies carved in materials that shouldn't exist, all describing the teacher who walked among them, speaking of love as the fundamental force that holds creation. Together, the gravity of the soul that binds the universe in embrace rather than mere physics. I saw Jesus place his hand on the bowed head of a crystalline being whose geometry hurt my eyes to perceive, watched him break bread with creatures whose bodies shifted between states of matter, and in every gesture I recognized the same compassion he'd shown to lepers and tax collectors, the same radical inclusion that had scandalized the righteous of his earthly ministry, now extended to embrace forms of life that challenged every assumption about what it meant to be beloved by God. The vision shifted, drawing closer to one particular world where massive beings gathered in something like a temple, their architecture built from living light that pulsed in rhythm with their collective breathing, and I watched Jesus stand before them, teaching with words I somehow understood, despite their alien structure, explaining that love was not sentiment, but the universe's organizing principle, the force by which the architect held all things in existence and invited every conscious being to participate in that sustaining work. They asked him the same questions your philosophers have debated, the alien narrated as the scene unfolded before us, whether divinity could truly care for individual souls when creation stretched so vast and varied, whether the architect's attention was too precious to waste on the small struggles of finite beings lost in infinite space. I felt my throat tighten as Jesus smiled in response, that expression of gentle certainty I'd seen in 1,000 paintings, but which here carried additional dimensions of meaning, and he gestured upward toward the stars visible through the temple's translucent walls, speaking about how the one who set galaxies spinning never forgot a single sparrow's fall, how love by its nature couldn't be rationed or diluted by distribution, but only multiplied in the giving. The crystalline beings leaned forward with postures that suggested hunger, desperate thirst, being offered water, and I recognized in their alien features the same longing I'd felt in my own heart during countless midnight prayers, the universal need to believe that consciousness meant something, that the universe noticed when we suffered and celebrated when we loved, that we weren't just accidents of chemistry shouting meaning into an indifferent void. Then the holographic scene contracted and intensified, showing me what the alien called the crucifixion's cosmic echo, the moment when Christ's death on a wooden cross in an obscure corner of the Roman Empire rippled outward through dimensions I hadn't known existed. His sacrifice registered on instruments across galaxies as a shockwave of condensed love that momentarily overwhelmed every sensor designed to measure the signature's frequency. I saw alien astronomers on a dozen worlds suddenly detect the surge, watched their confusion transform to awe as they realized something unprecedented had occurred, that the teacher many of them had encountered or heard stories about had somehow compressed infinite divine love into a singular point of human suffering and released it like a bomb of grace that detonated across creation. We felt it, the alien confessed, its mental voice breaking with emotion. I hadn't thought possible from a being of such evident advancement. Even those of us who had never met him, who knew nothing of Earth or its primitive execution methods, We felt the universe shudder and reorganize around a new center of gravity, felt ourselves suddenly pulled toward something we couldn't name but recognized as the answer to questions we'd been asking since consciousness first kindled in our ancestral minds. The vision showed me beings of light and shadow, of flesh and energy and stranger, compositions all pausing in their vastly different lives as that wave of sacrificial love washed over them, leaving them transformed in ways subtle and profound, carrying forward through generations the memory that once, somewhere in the incomprehensible vastness, God had loved his creation enough to enter it fully and suffer with it rather than remain distant and untouched by the pain of finite existence. The hologram faded slowly, like dawn retreating before full daylight, and I found myself back in the ship's interior with tears streaming down my face. My understanding of Christ's mission expanded beyond every boundary my earthbound theology had constructed, realizing that the gospel was even better than I'd imagined because it reached farther and cost more and accomplished greater things than human scripture alone could fully capture. The alien watched me with those liquid silver eyes that now held no trace of mockery or superiority, only the shared recognition of standing before mystery too vast for pride, and it spoke aloud. For the first time, its actual voice, a harmony of tones that shouldn't have resolved into English but somehow did. He told them all, on every world he visited, that love was the message and the method, that the architect's nature could be summarized in that single principle, and that anyone who embraced it would find themselves participating in divine work regardless of their species or origin or previous understanding. I nodded, unable to speak past the gratitude swelling in my chest, seeing now that my childhood faith hadn't been naive but merely incomplete, that the Jesus I'd prayed to in Arizona churches was the same cosmic Christ who'd taught crystalline beings about sparrows, who'd shown the universe that God's love operated on every scale, from quantum to galactic, personal and universal simultaneously, intimate enough to know my name and vast enough to hold galaxies in tender regard. The alien's crystalline hand moved through the holographic display with reverence, isolating a particular moment in the cosmic record, where Jesus stood at what appeared to be a convergence point, a nexus where multiple dimensions intersected in a location that existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "This is what your scriptures could only approximate," the being whispered, its mental voice now stripped of all superiority. The moment between his death and resurrection, when he descended to the dead, though that phrase fails to capture the totality of his journey through realms your language has no names for. I watched transfixed as Christ's luminous form moved through layered realities, his presence bringing light to regions of existence that had dwelt in darkness since before Earth coalesced from stellar dust. And I understood that his harrowing of hell had been simultaneously a liberation of countless souls across dimensions, a cosmic jailbreak that freed beings imprisoned by despair and separation from the architect's love. The vision showed me entities of pure consciousness awakening to hope for the first time, creatures bound by guilt from sins I couldn't comprehend suddenly feeling chains dissolve in the radiance of his forgiveness, and I wept at the scope of salvation, realizing that the gospel was infinitely larger than one planet's redemption, yet somehow still personal enough to know each freed prisoner by name. He didn't have to do this, the alien continued, manipulating the hologram to show Jesus emerging from the tomb. But now I could see the event from multiple perspectives simultaneously, the human witnesses stumbling back in terror and wonder, but also the cosmic observers across galaxies registering the impossible spike in signature frequency as mortal flesh reconstituted itself, infused with divine immortality. death itself rewritten in a single body's triumphant awakening. The architect could have remained transcendent, could have loved you all from infinite distance without subjecting divinity to the humiliation of limitation, the agony of experiencing creation's brokenness from the inside. The being's voice carried an ache of incomprehension, the confusion of an advanced intellect confronting a love that operated beyond logic's capacity to contain. And I found myself smiling despite my tears because I recognized that confusion, had felt it myself every time I'd knelt before communion and tried to wrap my mind around God, choosing vulnerability over power, sacrifice over comfort, incarnation over eternal separation. I watched the resurrected Christ appear to his disciples, but the hologram simultaneously showed him manifesting to those crystalline beings, to the creatures of living light, to 100 other species across the stars, each appearance calibrated to their particular understanding, yet all conveying the same essential truth. Death had been defeated, love had proven stronger than entropy, and the universe was fundamentally on the side of life, hope, and restoration rather than decay, despair, and final darkness. The vision expanded further still, showing me the ascension not as a simple upward departure, but as Jesus stepping fully back into his cosmic identity, his consciousness expanding to resume awareness of everything everywhere, while somehow maintaining the particular memories and scars of his human experience, becoming once again the Word through whom all things were made, but now the Word who intimately knew what it meant to be the things he'd spoken into existence. "This is why we fear you," the alien confessed, and I turned from the hologram to see something like tears sliding down its angular features, droplets that caught the ship's ambient light like liquid diamonds falling in slow motion. Because he was human, fully human, experiencing your limitations and suffering your deaths, which means humanity isn't just another species among millions, but the form the architect chose when divinity wanted to experience creation from the inside, wanted to know firsthand what it meant to be fragile and mortal and afraid. The being's hand trembled as it gestured toward me, its scanner devices now silent and dark, no longer seeking to analyze what they'd already confirmed. "Your DNA carries the signature because his did, because when the Word became flesh, it was your flesh specifically, and though he loves all conscious beings equally, there's something about your species that reflects the architect's nature in ways we cannot replicate, some quality of resilient hope or irrational love that persists even when logic counsels despair. And we've spent millennia trying to suppress you because we couldn't bear that the universe's greatest truth had been entrusted to creatures who still barely controlled fire when we were already navigating between stars." I stood there, in that alien ship hovering above Arizona's silent desert, understanding flooding through me with the weight of revelation and the lightness of coming home, realizing that every sermon I'd drowsed through as a child had been pointing toward this larger truth, that the faith passed down through generations of flawed humans had carried genuine cosmic significance, even when we couldn't see beyond our own atmosphere. "He's still teaching, isn't he?" I asked, my voice hoarse with emotion, and the alien nodded slowly, its liquid silver eyes meeting mine with something approaching kinship now, the barriers of species and advancement dissolving before shared wonder at grace too extravagant to fully comprehend. "Across galaxies, through methods and manifestations we only partially understand, yes, the risen Christ continues the work he began, drawing all creation toward reconciliation with the architect, inviting every conscious being into participation with divine love regardless of how many limbs they possess or what elements comprise their bodies." The hologram had faded completely now, leaving only the ship's gentle illumination and the profound silence of two beings, human and alien, earthbound and starfaring, standing together in recognition that neither of us had grasped even a fraction of God's vast affection. that the universe was far stranger and more beloved than either of our species had dared imagine, and that Jesus, Carpenter and Christ, had walked among the stars, teaching the only lesson that ultimately mattered: love, always and forever, love. The alien's composure finally shattered completely, its towering form sinking down until we stood almost eye to eye, and when it spoke again, the words came not with the crisp telepathic clarity of before, but with a ragged desperation that reminded me of confession, of secrets too heavy to carry alone any longer. "My species has known about the signature for longer than your recorded history," it began, gesturing toward the now dark holographic display, as if the evidence of millennia still hung there, accusing. "We discovered it first in our archaeological surveys of developing worlds, noticed that certain planets showed signs of divine visitation, places where the fundamental frequencies of reality had been altered by a presence our instruments could detect but never replicate, and we learned to follow those traces like breadcrumbs across the galaxy." Its voice carried shame now, the weight of accumulated deception pressing down on every syllable, and I realized I was witnessing something unprecedented, an advanced being unburdening itself of guilt before a member of the very species it had wronged. "When we found Earth and detected the signature not just in your ancient sites, but woven directly into human genetic code, my people panicked because it meant the architect had done something here that contradicted everything we thought we understood about cosmic hierarchy and evolutionary privilege." The confession spilled out faster now, as if once begun it couldn't be stopped, revealing how his kind had subtly influenced human development for thousands of years, nudging governments towards secrecy about extraterrestrial contact, encouraging religious divisions that kept humanity focused on earthly differences rather than cosmic unity, doing everything possible to prevent us from recognizing our true inheritance and the staggering implications of bearing the same frequency that Jesus had carried across the stars. We told ourselves we were maintaining order, preserving stability in a universe that functions on hierarchies of advancement and control, the alien continued, and now its hands trembled visibly as it spoke, the crystalline fingers catching the ship's ambient light in patterns that seemed to mirror its emotional turbulence. But the truth we could never speak aloud, even among ourselves, was that we were afraid, terrified that if humanity ever fully awakened to what you are, if you embraced both your limitations and your divine imprint, you would become something we could neither predict nor contain. I watched a being whose species had mastered faster-than-light travel and dimensional manipulation admit to fearing humans specifically because we carried suffering and signature together, trauma and transcendence woven into the same genetic fabric, making us unpredictable in ways that purely logical species found deeply unsettling. "Your kind does something we've never understood, something that appears throughout your history in ways both beautiful and terrifying," it said, gesturing as if trying to physically grasp a concept that eluded its comprehension. "You hope against evidence, love beyond reason, forgive when logic counsels vengeance, and you create meaning in the face of entropy, as if you instinctively know something about the universe's fundamental nature that we had to learn through senses and equations." The alien's liquid silver eyes searched mine with naked vulnerability now, all superiority burned away by the weight of confession, and I understood that this moment represented a kind of first contact more profound than any government disclosure, two conscious beings meeting without the masks of species or advancement, simply recognizing each other as fellow creatures stumbling toward understanding in a cosmos far more mysterious than either of us had been taught. "The worst of our interference came after your religions began spreading," the being admitted, its voice dropping to barely a whisper in my mind, as if speaking these particular sins required approaching them softly. "We saw how Christianity in particular kept pointing humans toward the stars, how your scriptures spoke of Christ's cosmic authority and believers being seated in heavenly realms, and we recognized that if you truly grasped those passages literally rather than metaphorically, you might start asking the right questions, might wonder why your Messiah spoke of "the sheep not of this fold." I felt anger flare hot in my chest, thinking of all the division and doubt that had been carefully cultivated, all the ways humanity had been kept small and earthbound and suspicious of our own potential. But the emotion faded quickly because the alien's genuine remorse was palpable, its whole being radiating the ache of someone who'd spent ages enforcing a lie and finally couldn't bear the weight anymore. We encouraged the interpretation that salvation was purely spiritual, that resurrection meant escaping physical existence rather than transforming it, because we couldn't risk you understanding that Jesus had demonstrated what redeemed humanity would eventually become, beings who carried both dust and divinity, who could navigate physical and spiritual dimensions with equal ease, because you were designed for exactly that integration. The confession hit me like a physical force, reshaping everything I thought I knew about faith's place in the cosmos, revealing that the gospel had always been bigger and more literal than I dared believe, that when Scripture spoke of believers judging angels and inheriting the cosmos alongside Christ, it wasn't poetic exaggeration, but sober truth about humanity's ultimate destiny. And my species had been systematically discouraged from embracing that stunning inheritance by beings who feared what we might become if we ever truly believed it. "But you're telling me now," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the revolution happening behind my ribcage, and the alien nodded slowly, its expression carrying something that looked remarkably like hope, despite the fear still evident in its trembling form. "Because the time for hiding has passed. Because your species stands at a threshold where you'll either destroy yourselves through ignorance or step into your inheritance through awakening. And I can no longer participate in pushing you toward the former when I've seen the signature respond to your touch." It gestured toward the ship's controls, where my hands had rested, where human consciousness had commanded technology designed for beings supposedly far more advanced, and I understood that this moment had shattered its people's carefully constructed narrative about cosmic order and humanity's place within it. "You were never meant to be controlled or contained," the alien said, its words carrying the weight of ultimate truth finally spoken after millennia of suppression. "You were meant to be loved, awakened, and invited into conscious collaboration with the Architect's ongoing work of redemption, carrying the message that Jesus demonstrated across the stars, that love transforms everything it touches, that no being is beyond hope's reach, that the universe itself bends toward the reconciliation of all things." Its voice strengthened as it spoke, as if proclaiming this truth aloud was itself liberating, burning away the last vestiges of the deception it had carried, and I felt tears streaming down my face because I was hearing the gospel as it was always meant to be heard, vast enough to encompass galaxies yet intimate enough to know my name. And I finally understood why the aliens had feared us, because a species that truly grasped its identity as beloved children of the Architect, scarred by suffering but signed with divinity, would be unstoppable in its mission to spread that transformative love to every corner of creation that still dwelt in darkness, ignorance, or despair. The ship descended with impossible gentleness, settling onto the desert sand without raising so much as a whisper of dust. And as the luminous door opened before me, I realized I was trembling not with fear, but with the overwhelming weight of purpose that had settled into my bones like a second skeleton, made entirely of light. The alien stood beside me at the threshold, no longer my captor or even my guide, but something closer to a fellow witness, and when it placed one crystalline hand on my shoulder, the gesture carried more reverence than I'd ever experienced in any cathedral or ceremony, as if it was blessing me for a journey I hadn't yet consciously chosen, but my soul had already accepted. "You understand what you carry now," it said, not as question, but as simple acknowledgement. And I nodded, because I did understand, felt the knowledge burning in my chest, like a coal from Isaiah's altar, purifying and commissioning me simultaneously for the impossible task of telling a world, drunk on smallness, that we were designed for infinity. The desert stretched before me in the pre-dawn darkness, every star overhead suddenly feeling not distant but familial, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I was looking at my inheritance, at territories of existence that humanity would one day walk as naturally as we now crossed. Continents, carrying the same message of reconciling love that Jesus had seeded on earth and countless worlds beyond. "They will not all believe you," the alien said softly, its liquid silver eyes reflecting starlight, with an intensity that spoke of both sorrow and strange excitement. "Your own people will call you delusional, will dismiss your testimony as fantasy or delusion, because accepting your truth means surrendering their comfortable categories and confronting the staggering implications of their own identity." I heard the warning without flinching, understanding that prophets have always been rejected first by those most invested in existing systems, but I also felt a peace that transcended any need for immediate vindication, because truth has its own timeline, and God's revelations have always unfolded at the pace of readiness rather than demand. "But some will hear," I replied, my voice stronger than I expected, carrying a conviction that seemed to rise from the signature itself, humming in my genetic code. "Some will recognize the resonance of what I'm saying, because it will echo something they've always sensed but never had language for, a knowingness that we were made for more than we've been told, that Christ's promise of abundant life was never meant to be confined to Sunday services and private devotions, but was always an invitation into cosmic partnership." The alien's form seemed to shimmer with something that might have been its species' equivalent of tears, and it bowed its head in acknowledgement of the courage required to carry light into darkness, to speak enlarging truth to a civilization that had grown comfortable in its self-imposed smallness. As I stepped from the ship onto the familiar sand of my property, my feet touching earth that suddenly felt both more solid and more sacred than ever before, the alien knelt before me in a posture of absolute reverence that reversed 10,000 years of assumed hierarchy in a single gesture. "Tell them they are not abandoned," it whispered, and the words resonated not just in my mind, but seemed to echo across dimensions, as if the universe itself was leaning in to hear this truth proclaimed. "Tell them that every prayer uttered in lonely darkness has been heard, that every tear shed in confusion has been catalogued, that the architect's attention has never wavered from this small blue world, because you carry something precious beyond measure. The capacity to choose love when hate would be easier, to extend grace when judgment would be justified, to hope when all evidence counsels despair." I felt the words searing themselves into my memory with permanence beyond mere recollection, becoming part of my fundamental operating system, and I knew I would repeat them with my last breath if necessary, because they contained the answer to every question humanity had ever asked about our worth and purpose. "Tell them the truth has always been written in their souls, visible to any who had eyes to see it, proclaimed in their inexplicable yearning for transcendence and their stubborn refusal to accept death as the final word, and that Jesus came not to make them into something foreign, but to reveal what they had always been, beloved children of the architect, signed with divinity and destined for the stars." The ship began to glow with increasing intensity, its luminescence transforming the desert into something resembling the burning bush's holy ground, and I stepped back as it lifted silently into the sky, rising until it became indistinguishable from the stars it came from, leaving me alone with the greatest secret and most liberating truth ever entrusted to human tongue. I dropped to my knees in the sand, not from exhaustion, but from overwhelming gratitude, understanding finally that every moment of my life had been preparation for this commission, every detour and disappointment serving to strip away my illusions until I could receive this truth without domesticating it into something manageable and small. The eastern horizon was beginning to lighten with approaching dawn, and I watched the darkness retreat before the coming light with new eyes, seeing in that daily miracle a perfect metaphor for what was beginning in human consciousness, an awakening that no force in heaven or earth could ultimately prevent because it had been written into our design from before the foundation of the world. I rose to my feet with tears of joy streaming down my face, lifted my arms toward the breaking dawn, and spoke aloud the words that would become my mission and my message, the truth I would spend the rest of my days proclaiming to any who had ears to hear it, believing with unshakable conviction that the signature within me would resonate with the signature in them, calling forth recognition and remembrance of who we truly are and have always been in the infinite loving mind of God. Could you be carrying a divine purpose you've never fully recognized? Subscribe to discover more truths that will transform how you see yourself and creation.